This is a social science thinking lecture for the solutions module for Europe and Russia. Last time we talked about empiricism, and we know now that what differentiates science from other forms of knowledge is that science's complete use of empiricism. Now, empiricism can mean both qualitative data and also quantitative data. Although right now in this course we've been focusing on quantitative data, we'll talk a little bit about qualitative data later in the course. We know that data needs to be systematic and needs to be regular, but one of the things that often throws people in the social sciences, particularly at the introductory level, is the difference between absolute and relative forms of data. And so I want to make sure that that's really clear to everybody. For some of you, this is very easy and natural and you've dealt with this before, but a few people will still need to wrap their heads around this. Absolute data is data that deals with actual counts of something or events. How many of something happens. Relative numbers are absolute numbers that are against the total population in a given society. So for example, if we talk about diseases and we talk about how many people have a disease or how many people died of that disease, we're talking about absolute numbers. But if we compare how many people had a disease or died of that disease to the rest of the population, we're making that data relative. And relative data is what's really important in the social sciences. Here's a great example of it. I selected 15 countries from around the world, different development levels, different sizes, really just my call, not too systematic. And I collected the data on how many people had died in 2013 from tuberculosis in those countries. And you can see, looking at this chart, that India, China, Indonesia, and Bangladesh have a huge number of tuberculosis deaths compared to countries like Guinea-Bissau and Liberia and Bolivia. Now, if you hadn't thought much about relative versus absolute numbers, you'd think this is a really big problem in these countries, and these other countries, not so big a problem. But now, let's take these deaths and compare them against the total population. This chart shows the relative number of tuberculosis deaths. Out of a population of 100,000 in each of these countries, how many died of tuberculosis in 2013? Suddenly you can see Lesotho, Guinea-Bissau, Liberia jump to the top. China, India, they're still high. Indonesia are still high, but they've dropped down significantly and their rates are a lot lower. And that's of course because these are some of the biggest countries of the world in terms of total population. And because there's so many people, there are going to be tuberculosis deaths in these countries. But other countries rise to the top, even though they have much smaller populations. Tuberculosis is a much bigger problem. Now you see, I'm looking at the relative number of deaths here as well, that United States and France, very developed countries, are quite low on the list. Here's a list where the United States did not want to be number one. So the importance of this is, of course, it helps us to be systematic about numbers. Absolute numbers are very important, and we should never forget that millions of people die of tuberculosis, but they don't allow us to make strong global comparisons across societies, and that's what we need to be able to do in this course, and that's why we use, for the most part, relative numbers in this course rather than absolute numbers, especially when making comparisons.